He arrived with a gentle smile, a modest camera slung over his shoulder, and a practiced aura of humility, saying he had come to tell Africa's story through its own voices, to shine a light on the overlooked struggles and daily triumphs of a resilient people. But what no one realized, at least not at first, was that beneath the lens and rehearsed compliments lay something far darker, a purpose not rooted in storytelling but in extraction, not in understanding but in mapping, and not in truth but in leverage. He wasn't here to reveal Africa to the world but to expose Africa's vulnerabilities to powers far beyond its borders. His name was Julien Morel, and he was French, pale-skinned, clean-shaven, wearing pressed beige trousers and polished loafers that spoke of Parisian side streets, not red soil roads, and he passed through customs at Ouagadougou International Airport without issue, flashing a tourist visa and a press badge clipped conspicuously to his chest while explaining, fluent French and with disarming charm, that he was a freelance journalist on assignment to explore the challenges facing Burkina Faso's security infrastructure, to capture the voices of soldiers and civilians alike, to humanize the headlines, as he called it, and as he smiled and praised the bravery of President Ibrahim Tarore, noting with careful emphasis how rare it was to see a young African leader stand firm against Western pressure, the customs officer waved him through without suspicion, because who would suspect a polite man with pens for schoolchildren and compliments for leadership? And indeed, once in the city, Julien played his role with methodical precision, offering bottles of cold water to sweating taxi drivers, gifting cheap but colorful stationery to wide-eyed village kids, sipping hot tea in dusty market stalls while taking photos of goats and golden sunsets, posing as a romantic foreigner enthralled by the raw poetry of African life. And yet, while his camera did capture faces and landscapes, its memory card was filling with coordinates, not conversations. Because over the following weeks, Julien began to move in increasingly curious patterns, venturing beyond the expected circuits of a visiting reporter, lingering near military zones and logistics hubs, asking pointed questions cloaked in innocent inquiry about supply chains, troop movements, patrol schedules, and mineral exports. And when he stood near a fenced rail depot and asked a sleepy guard about the frequency of shipments, joking that journalists are just curious by nature, the soldier laughed but also noted to a colleague that this white man asked more questions than some officers, and while Julien remained careful, always staying in local guest houses, never drinking, never inviting visitors, always polite, there were details that began to unsettle those around him. The fact that he never used a local SIM card, that he made encrypted international calls late at night, that he never published a single story online or shared photos with any media platform, always claiming his material was being compiled for a special European report, though no one could find any record of his work in French publications or international outlets. Eventually, the quiet murmurings reached the ears of Burkina Faso's intelligence services, who had learned long ago that invasion rarely came with guns anymore but often through pens, contracts, aid packages, or cameras, and so they began to monitor him subtly, cloning his phone's data without touching it, tracing the origins of his digital transmissions, matching timestamps and GPS logs against public statements, and soon, a troubling pattern emerged. Julien had visited 9 sites near military installations, filmed interviews with guards at 3 sensitive locations, and sent encrypted emails at odd hours to servers registered in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire, one of which matched an IP address linked to a French military contractor previously identified by local analysts as working under diplomatic cover. The gravity of these findings demanded discretion, and so President Ibrahim Tarore, rather than mobilize arrests or issue loud accusations, devised something more precise, something surgical. He invited the supposed journalist to a press conference, not a dramatic raid but a public encounter where the truth could reveal itself under the quiet pressure of facts. And so an invitation was issued quietly, with Julien's name added to the guest list only minutes before the event, ensuring he would not suspect anything was amiss. When he arrived at the presidential compound, he did so with his usual air of confidence, wearing the same press badge, carrying his well-worn notebook and a leather satchel filled with recording gear, greeting soldiers at the gate with a friendly, "Bonjour, je suis ici pour la conférence de presse," to which a guard, suppressing his own suspicion, nodded and motioned him forward. Inside the room, the atmosphere was calm but strangely tense. 6. Chairs arranged in a half-circle, cameras already rolling, no flashy backdrops, no international media, only a handful of local journalists handpicked for their discretion and integrity. Julian took his seat, crossed his legs, and opened his notebook, scanning the room and sensing a certain chill but attributing it to nerves or unfamiliarity, until the door opened and President Ibrahim Traore entered. Not in a tailored suit but in military fatigues, standing tall, composed, his posture speaking of authority without theatrics. And as Julian stood and extended his hand, saying, "Mr. President, it's an honor," Traore shook it firmly and replied with the quiet force of a man who already knew the ending, "You've been asking many questions, Mr. Morel. Today I will answer them. But first, I have a few of my own." And it was at that moment that the energy in the room shifted. Julian's smile faltered ever so slightly, and though he chuckled and said, "Of course, that's what interviews are for," his eyes flicked nervously to the cameras, to the journalists, to the soldier now stepping forward with a sealed folder in his hands, and the president continued, "You have been in our country for 23 days. You have visited 9 military-adjacent zones. You have filmed 3 strategic locations under the pretense of interviews." And as Julian tried to protest, his voice cracked just slightly, "I'm a journalist. That's what we do. We go where the stories are." But Traore's face didn't shift, and he asked quietly, "Is it also common for journalists to send encrypted messages at 2:17 a.m. to servers in Côte d'Ivoire?" And when Julian blinked, the soldier opened the folder and produced photographs. Julian in his guest house, lit by laptop glow, sending emails through an encrypted mail client. Julian standing outside a restricted radio tower, phone in hand, and finally, screenshots of correspondence with a known intelligence asset, a man tied to French defense networks in West Africa. And as the evidence was presented, Julian's confidence collapsed like a tent in the wind, his explanations crumbling into fragmented denials. I can explain. Those were just notes, drafts, journalistic references, but each line fell flat under the weight of surveillance logs, timestamps, and intercepted messages, including one in particular where he described palace security as thin near Westgate and suggested it can be monitored for future asset placement, a phrase that no journalist would ever write but which appeared, unmistakably, on a document printed from Julian's own hard drive, discovered on a laptop seized the night before without his knowledge, and when the screen was powered on and connected to a projector, revealing a detailed satellite map of Burkina Faso with strategic pins and notes marked, "For review, Côte d'Ivoire client." The room went completely still except for the faint whir of recording equipment. Julian's mouth opened, then closed again, his eyes wide, his fingers trembling slightly as he reached for his bag, not in defense but in sheer disbelief at how thoroughly the ground beneath him had been removed. And then, with absolute clarity and no need for rage, President Traore stepped toward the microphone, looked into the camera, and said, "This man says he came to understand our people. But in truth, he came to record our weak points, to map our movements, and to send our secrets abroad. He came not to tell our story, but to write his own." And then, after a breath, he added the words that would reverberate across a continent, "Let the people decide if this is journalism or betrayal." The days that followed Julian Morel's exposure were not filled with loud celebrations or parades of triumph. Rather, they unfolded with the eerie quiet of a nation holding its breath, its citizens watching not merely a foreigner caught in espionage but the naked mechanics of a war that had long been invisible, fought not with bullets but with wires, data, persuasion, and betrayal. And while international news outlets scrambled to spin the event, some calling it a misunderstanding, others accusing President Ibrahim Traore of authoritarian theatrics, the people of Burkina Faso knew better. They had seen the patterns, the sudden chaos after foreign aid visits, the unmarked flights at midnight, the mysteriously timed attacks on strategic convoys just after consultants had passed through. And so when Traore stood before the cameras and declared that Julian's actions were the symptom, not the disease, he was not exaggerating but naming what many had suspected, that Africa was still at war, not for flags or ideologies, but for control, for extraction, for silence, and that silence had eyes, white, well-dressed, well-funded eyes. And now that one had been caught, others would begin to shift, hide, retreat, or strike. And strike they did, not through assassins or airstrikes, but through a new kind of warfare: media manipulation, diplomatic pressure, economic sabotage dressed as sanctions, and whispered threats disguised as statements of concern. For within hours of the exposure, the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued a statement calling for Julian's immediate release, claiming his arrest violated international norms regarding press freedom, and branding the Burkinabe government's actions deeply troubling. And though the man had been caught with encrypted files, detailed military maps, and correspondences with known intelligence assets, Western media outlets, from Paris to Brussels, quickly adopted a single narrative: that he was a journalist, unfairly targeted for telling hard truths. And in the carefully worded articles published in Le Monde, The Guardian, and even The Washington Post, there was little mention of the data recovered from Julian's laptop, the surveillance logs, the email threads planning placement operations along the country's southern border. Instead, there were images of Julian smiling beside children in colorful villages, quotes from unnamed NGO sources claiming he was a kind man, always respectful, and background pieces on how Burkina Faso's press freedom rankings had slipped under Traoré's administration. And though the president had not jailed a single journalist nor banned a single outlet, the international press painted him as a dictator in waiting, all while ignoring the deeper reality that Burkina Faso, under his leadership, had done what few dared to do. It had looked directly into the eyes of empire and said, "No more." And that defiance was more dangerous to global power structures than any weapon. And so the next blow came not through the media but through finance. Development loans suddenly frozen, aid packages delayed for review, and behind closed doors, calls made to multinational corporations urging them to suspend operations in Burkina Faso until the government resolved its governance issues, which was to say, until it backed down, apologized, handed Julian over quietly, and resumed expected subservience. But Traoré refused, and in private meetings with his intelligence chiefs and trusted advisors, he spoke not in anger but with the calm of a man who had anticipated this moment, who understood that sovereignty came at a price, and who was prepared to pay it, for he had not entered politics to be celebrated by the West but to protect his people from precisely this brand of quiet conquest. And now, the masks were off. Still, he knew that confrontation alone would not suffice. That the true war was for narrative, for legitimacy, for the minds of both his citizens and the broader African continent. And so he took an unprecedented step. He ordered the release of the full dossier on Julian Morel, not just to local media, but to every African embassy, university, and independent newsroom, translated into 5 languages, with redactions only where necessary to protect the names of local informants. The document, titled "Silence Has Eyes: The Case Against Foreign Meddling in Burkina Faso," was not a rant or political screed but a meticulous account of Julian's movements, messages, and methods, complete with timestamps, geolocations, intercepted files, and corroborated witness testimony. And within 48 hours, it went viral across the continent, not through official news channels but through WhatsApp groups, encrypted Telegram networks, and grassroots newsletters run by students and activists who had long suspected that their nations were being quietly mapped and harvested. Suddenly, conversations erupted in Dakar, Lagos, Kinshasa, and Harare, not about Burkina Faso's alleged oppression, but about the legacy of colonial intelligence networks, the blurred lines between journalism and espionage, and the dangerous assumption that Westerners always arrived as neutral observers rather than interested actors. And in this awakening, Traoré found allies, not governments, which were still tangled in debt and dependency, but people, journalists in Ghana who began re-examining foreign aid workers operating near gold mines, students in Tanzania who launched podcasts dissecting IMF conditionalities, young filmmakers in Kenya who declared that the age of the quiet spy is over. And everywhere, the question arose: if Julian was caught in Burkina Faso, how many more are walking freely across Africa? Under different names, passports, missions? But as the public conversation expanded, the diplomatic game grew colder. France formally suspended all military cooperation with Burkina Faso, withdrew its ambassador, and issued economic warnings to Francophone nations still within its sphere, signaling that solidarity with Traore would come at a price, and while some leaders caved, issuing tepid statements about respecting international norms, others remained silent, waiting, calculating. Meanwhile, inside Burkina Faso, Traore doubled down on national self-reliance, announcing sweeping reforms in security coordination, cybersecurity, and media literacy, launching a new intelligence unit trained specifically to detect non-military infiltration tactics, and unveiling an African Cyber Defense Initiative (ACDI), inviting participation from peer nations facing similar threats. And though funding was scarce and resources limited, the political will was unshakable, because now the people understood the stakes, not in abstract terms, but in the image of a man with a camera and a notebook who was not capturing their beauty, but studying their weaknesses. Still, Julian himself remained at the center of it all, not imprisoned in a dark cell, but held under house arrest in a modest compound guarded not by brute force but by the weight of what he represented. A foreign agent wrapped in press credentials, a tool of information warfare who had, perhaps, believed his mission was righteous or at least justifiable, but who now sat in silence, watching his face appear on screens he had once hoped to control. And it was in this silence that Traore made his next move, not to punish Julian further, but to expose the entire architecture behind him. And so, after weeks of forensic analysis, the government released a second report, this one titled Operation Sable Noir, Mapping the Network, which detailed the chain of communications, bank transfers, and mission briefings that had preceded Julian's arrival, revealing a broader web of corporate intelligence contractors, diplomatic intermediaries, and shadowy think tanks operating under the guise of regional stability initiatives, all tracing back to nodes in Paris, Abidjan, and more. Surprisingly, Geneva, where a neutral nonprofit had been co-opted as a data laundering front, and the shock of this revelation caused ripple effects far beyond Burkina Faso, triggering parliamentary inquiries in Belgium, denials from French officials, and hastily deleted web pages from the implicated NGO, whose board members quietly resigned one by one as public scrutiny mounted. By now, the narrative had shifted irrevocably from the tale of a lone journalist caught in an authoritarian dragnet to the undeniable evidence of a coordinated surveillance operation targeting an African nation under the guise of soft power diplomacy. And while many Western outlets still tried to frame the story in ambiguous terms, their own credibility had eroded, especially among African readers who now saw every exposé or aid report through the lens of strategic interest. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, Traore remained calm, holding weekly dialogues with student groups, civil society leaders, and regional governors, emphasizing that the struggle was not against France or the West per se, but against a system of exploitation disguised as partnership, and he made clear that Burkina Faso would not retaliate with vengeance but with vigilance, not with isolation but with integrity. And then, in a final act of narrative control, he did something no one expected. He invited Julian Morel to speak publicly, not under duress or stagecraft, but in a carefully controlled forum broadcast across the nation, where he would be given the chance to explain himself, to answer the questions that had haunted the public. Why? For whom? With what justification? And though many expected Julian to refuse, to remain silent, he surprised everyone, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of fear, or perhaps because he saw, finally, that he had become a symbol far larger than himself, and so, dressed simply, with no script and no lawyers, he stood behind a microphone and spoke, first with hesitations, then with increasing clarity, confessing that he had indeed worked under contract for a security advisory group based in Abidjan, that he had been tasked with collecting data under the guise of journalism, and that he had believed, wrongly, that the mission was for stability, not for exploitation. He admitted that his reports had been used to advise on regional troop placements, that his maps had been integrated into operational planning, and that he had been told, explicitly, to avoid any documentation that might tie his work to state entities. And as he spoke, the room remained silent, not in rage, but in recognition, for here was not just a spy, but a mirror reflecting the system that had operated for decades beneath their feet. When he finished, Traore thanked him, not with warmth, but with a grave nod, and said only, "Truth is not redemption. But it is a beginning," and with that, the broadcast ended, not with applause, but with a shared understanding that a line had been crossed and a veil had been lifted. And so Burkina Faso did not crumble under pressure, nor bow under threat. It stood, wounded but wiser, not just for itself but for a continent awakening to the slow violence of silence. The fallout from Julian Morel's confession was not a mere media sensation. It was the cracking open of a long-buried tomb, the kind that stank not of death but of carefully perfumed deceptions layered through decades of treaties, partnerships, and technical cooperation agreements that had, for too long, sedated a continent into believing its subjugation was professionalism, its marginalization mere logistics, and its pillaging inevitable economics. And in the quiet that followed the broadcast, as Burkina Faso collectively processed the magnitude of what had been admitted not just by a man but by a machine through him, the streets did not explode with anger but with reflection, for the people now had proof that their suspicions were not paranoia but prophecy, that the gut feeling of being watched, manipulated, drained, and lied to had a name and a face and a flowchart of instructions written in a language they were never supposed to read, but they had read it, and now, with eyes unclouded, they began to speak it back, not in slogans but in policies, programs, and pedagogy. Traore knew that exposure alone could not bring change, that awareness without infrastructure was a scream into a void, and so he launched what would become the single most radical restructuring of national sovereignty in post-colonial West Africa, the Sovereign Continuum Initiative, SCI. A multidimensional blueprint not only for self-governance but for psychological liberation, beginning with an overhaul of education where history was no longer taught from the vantage of European expansion but from the lineage of resistance, resilience, and renaissance. He brought in linguists to revive indigenous languages not just for cultural pride but for state function, making them official mediums of government and legal discourse. He nationalized key digital infrastructure, ending reliance on foreign cloud servers for military or health data, and redirected defense spending toward local drone technology, cyber defense teams, and secure satellite communications in collaboration with engineers from Mali, Guinea, and Algeria, who, inspired by Burkina Faso's defiance, began sending delegations not in secrecy but in solidarity, and while Western diplomats clung to their old levers, offering renegotiated trade deals, new aid packages, and even private apologies, Traore responded with a simple, consistent refrain: "We welcome partnership, not surveillance. Friendship, not programming. Respect, not remote control." And those words echoed beyond Ouagadougou, into corridors of universities in South Africa, where students demanded audits of NGO networks, into the slums of Nairobi, where community organizers launched digital literacy campaigns warning of data harvesting, into the oil fields of Nigeria, where workers began asking who exactly conducted the impact assessments before contracts were signed, and most powerfully, into the streets of Paris, London, and Washington, D.C., where diaspora youth marched under banners reading, "Silence has eyes, but so do we," flipping the surveillance gaze back onto its architects. Meanwhile, Julian Morel remained under custodial observation, not imprisoned, but studied as one might study a rare, dangerous artifact, with the knowledge that to punish him excessively would martyr him, and to free him prematurely would invite reinfection. He spent his days writing, reflecting, and eventually recording a full account of his recruitment, training, and deployment, which Traore, in an act of unparalleled strategic brilliance, published in serialized form through a new Pan-African digital journal titled Sovereign Circuits, edited by young investigative journalists across 12 countries, transforming Julian's guilt into generative knowledge, into modules for intelligence training, counterintelligence workshops, and public discourse, reframing espionage from an act of elite secrecy to a shared civic defense. In this transformation, Burkina Faso became not a pariah but a pioneer, invited to speak at African Union assemblies not as a rogue actor but as the harbinger of a new continental security doctrine, one that prioritized informational sovereignty over foreign aid dependency, and this bold stance began to ripple through elections, policy shifts, and constitutional debates across Africa, from Namibia to Ethiopia. where youth movements invoked Traore's speeches not for personality cults but for policy frameworks, where politicians were now asked not, "Who do you know in the West?" but "How will you defend us from the quiet invasions?" And as this intellectual insurgency gained ground, the old powers grew restless, not merely because they were losing control of a region, but because the entire epistemology of their dominance was being dismantled, exposed, reverse-engineered by people they had trained, hosted in their think tanks, and assumed would be loyal conduits, only to watch them return home with new agendas, new questions, and an uncompromising clarity that development without dignity is domestication, that investment without transparency is surveillance, and that democracy, if mediated through foreign data centers, is occupation by other means. And it was in this climate that something extraordinary happened, spontaneous, decentralized, and driven not by politicians but by artists, coders, teachers, and soldiers. The formation of a Continental Data Defense Pact, initially informal, called the Kinshasa Protocol, in which over 30 civil society networks across 18 countries pledged to share intelligence about foreign contractors, suspect media patterns, and embedded data gathering operations disguised as academic research, forming the first truly Pan-African surveillance of the surveillors, where silence no longer had just eyes, but counter-surveillance ears, tongues, and teeth. And while Western capitals fumbled to respond, some attempting charm offensives, others threatening economic isolation, none could undo the psychic shift that had occurred, that Africa was no longer an object but a subject of its own analysis, and that even in poverty, fragmentation, or post-conflict trauma, it possessed a moral clarity and intellectual sovereignty that no satellite could intercept. By now, Ibrahim Tarore had become a global figure not by seeking attention but by refusing to perform the expected gestures of a responsible African leader, which, in Western parlance, meant compliant, conciliatory, and consumable, and instead embodying a kind of leadership rooted not in ideology but in memory, not in bravado but in boundaries, boundaries that said, "We are not your test market, your data mine, your eternal crisis laboratory." And in the final year of his presidency, as elections approached and constitutional term limits loomed, he shocked the world again, not by extending power, but by relinquishing it, refusing all calls to stay on, for stability's sake, declaring instead that the true test of sovereignty is not how long one holds power, but how freely one gives it up, and endorsing a new generation of technocrats, activists, and thinkers who had come of age not in the shadow of colonialism but in the sunlight of exposed strategy, and who now stood ready to lead with both vigilance and vision. And on the night of his farewell address, broadcast across Africa in multiple languages, Traore stood alone on a small stage. No flags behind him, no entourage at his sides, just one sentence on the screen: "Silence had eyes. Now we do too." And in his final words, he did not thank foreign allies, nor make predictions, but instead read the names of every Burkinabe intelligence officer, student, teacher, and farmer who had helped uncover the network behind Julian Morel, not as a roll call, but as a declaration that in this war, the invisible had become visible, the hunted had become hunters, and the watchers had become watched. And as he stepped down, not just from office but from global spectacle, the world realized that a page had turned, not a chapter in Burkina Faso's story, but in the long, unfinished volume of Africa's reclamation, authored not in conferences or communiques, but in the unflinching gaze of a people who finally saw through the silence.